Welcome to the full version of part 1. I'll be taking a little bit slower in this video so you can really see what I'm doing, but for those of you who digest information faster, there is a shorter version of this video that's a little bit more condensed. It contains the same fundamentals and basics of the software, but takes a little less time. So if you feel like that's for you, go ahead and click that below this video in the Canvas shell. Alright, so what you're going to do to start is go ahead and open up your browser, and you're going to navigate to blender.org. You can see right here. This will be the home page. It may look a little different depending on when you access this. So right here in the middle of the screen we have a download button. So we can click on that and it'll take us to the download tab. If it's not there, you can click download up here. This will give us the options of what we want to download. The default is the Windows installer, and it will give you the latest version. You can see here that if we click this, we have the different types. If you have a 32-bit or 64-bit and you have Mac OS or Linux, whatever you're choosing to download this on. You can also do it through Steam. So if you have Steam, you can open that, search for Blender, and it is a software already available through Steam, and that will auto update when they release each new version. Otherwise, you have to come back here and get the newest version. So whatever's best for you, so go ahead and download it. I already have it downloaded, so I'm not going to download it again, but once it's done downloading for you, you can go ahead and run the installer and have it install on your computer. Once you're done there, go ahead and launch the program, and that's where we'll be going from here. So you'll boot up to a screen that looks similar to this. Again, your picture will change depending on the version at the time when you download it. Your splash screen right here will also ask you whether you want to use right click or left click as your default selection. You can choose whichever is more comfortable for you. Most people choose left click because that's the default in most software, but whatever works better. So mine doesn't have that because I've already made my selection and have set up my preferences how I like them. So once you have that chosen and any other settings right there at the beginning that you want to have selected, you can go ahead and either click new over here, new file, or you can just click off and it'll get rid of the splash screen and put you into your default scene. So for me, my default scene does not have a cube in it because I saved a startup file that does not have a cube because I usually delete the cube anyway. So for you, you'll probably have a cube in it. So what you can do is just leave it like that for now, and we'll learn how to change your startup file later on. So we're going to start off here by learning how to understand the UI, just knowing what to look for, what buttons do what things, so we're not getting too confused or overwhelmed right at the beginning. And then we're going to learn how to navigate the viewport, because that's the most important fundamental that you'll have to learn about the software, is how to move in 3D space, what you can do, what the buttons in the viewport do, and so on. So we're going to go ahead and just look at these first few tabs up here. We're going to talk about this, and then we'll work our way around, and then we'll come into the viewport. So first off, you can see here we have file. File is just your basic stuff that you have in almost every software. If you need to start a new file, if you want to save, if you want to import or export other types of 3D objects, and then you have your defaults. So here you can see there's a save startup file. This is how I saved mine without the cube. So that's something that you can choose to do, and again, we'll talk more about that later on. Edit is pretty simple, undo, redo, stuff like that. Your preferences are here, so if you ever need to change something, we'll get into this pretty soon, but this is how you get to those. So we can close that for now. The render and the window tab aren't too important. You won't use these very often because there are shortcuts for most of the things that are available in these windows, or in these tabs, so we don't really need them. help. This is manuals, tutorials, stuff like that. So if you have a question, you can try finding it in the documentation online. So next to those, we have something that are called workspaces. So the workspace tabs you can click on, and I'm not going to go through all of them because they're pretty self-explanatory. All they're going to do is switch up a few of your windows. Like over here, we can see that it cleared up some space. Same thing with sculpting. It's going to give you a different type of window. So you can mess around with those, go through them. But for the most part, I stick in layout and I just edit the ones I want. I don't use these tabs too much. I will occasionally, but it's just personal preference. So what we can do is let's go ahead and continue on, and we'll look at our collections. So this right here is called your outliner. It shows you basically all the objects that are in your scene. So you can see here that if we click on camera, our camera gets highlighted. If we click on our cube gets highlighted. And if we click on our light gets highlighted. So this just allows us to keep track of where all our objects are, and if we need to find something pretty quickly. You can see here it's stored under something called a collection. This is how you keep things in groups. So if you have a bunch of objects you want all in one group that you can just turn off visibility on or delete or whatever the case may be, you can put them inside collections. So we'll figure out how to manage collections a little bit later when we start getting into more advanced projects, but for now, we'll just leave that alone. Over here are your most important tabs, I would say. This is how you deal with not only your rendering, but your objects, your object properties, your modifiers, and if you don't understand any of that, that's okay. We'll get into that a little bit. So right here, you can see that if you hover over each of the tabs, it tells you what that tab is. So we have render properties, output properties, view layer properties, and so on. So this is stuff that we will be using a lot because there's a ton of stuff that goes on in here that is extremely important to your workflow in Blender. For this moment though, we need to learn how to navigate in viewport before we can do anything with that side over there, because this is only going to affect our final product for the most part. So what we're going to do is go ahead and look at our viewport here. You can see that if I make a movement, you have these commands down here that are telling you what I'm doing. So if you're like unsure whether I just use a shortcut or what that shortcut might be, you can look down here, pause the video, or back it up a few frames and see what exactly it was that I pressed to get where I did. So first off, let's talk about the difference between all your modes. So you have down here a button that says object mode. So if you click on this, it brings up a whole bunch of modes. For now, we are going to be dealing with edit mode and object mode the most. So let's go ahead and leave it in object mode and just figure out how to look around. So the basic navigation is that if you scroll in and out, that's going to be your zoom. So just that's pretty standard. To rotate, you hold down your middle mouse button and you just move your mouse around. So that will orbit around your pivot point for your view. So you can see that that helps us move around. Now, if we want to pan, pan is holding shift and middle mouse button. So shift plus middle mouse button helps us pan. And those are your basic navigation. So zoom in, rotate around, and pan. So that's how you essentially navigate the viewport. If you're using a mouse, or sorry, if you're using a trackpad, you can use these commands up here, which are the same thing. So you have a zoom. If you hold it down and just move your mouse in and out, or your trackpad in and out, then you don't have to scroll. If you want to pan and you are again using a trackpad or don't have a middle mouse button, you can just hold this down and move like this, and you don't ever have to have a middle mouse button. Same thing for your like rotation. you can just grab this gimbal up here and move it around, and that will help you rotate around the scene. So now that we know how to navigate the viewport, let's take a look at what we can do with the objects inside the viewport, how to select things, how to move stuff around, and how to change the object modes or maybe delete something if we mess something up. So if you chose left click as your selection, then you can click on any object in the viewport by just making that selection. For me, my selection is right click because that's the old Blender default. So that's the way I learned how to use Blender. But you can see we can click on any of these objects that we have in the viewport here. So we knew that we could select them in the outliner up here, but this is the more convenient way of doing it most of the time. You just select the object you want. And then what we can do is say we want to move this cube. So over here, these tools allow us to do just that. So if we click on the move tool, we can see that we are able to move the cube along any of these axes. Your axes are labeled up here in case you're ever watching a YouTube video and they say move it along the x-axis. Well, your x-axis is your red one. So you can always remind yourself by looking up here at the gimbal. So you can move this any way you want. You can also grab the white circle here at the center, and that'll allow you to do a free move. So you can just drag it around and put it wherever you feel like it. So I don't really want to have it there. So what I can do is do Control Z, and that will put my cube back in the center once I undo all the movements that I made. And now I am going to want to rotate my cube. So you can click on the rotate button right here, and this allows you to rotate your cube. So as you might expect, you can rotate it along the axes. And then you can also rotate it freely by just clicking in the white circle and just dragging it around. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to leave it right there. And now I want to make it bigger. So I'm going to scale it up. I'm going to say I'm going to scale it up on the y-axis here and maybe on the z-axis. So I'm going to make my cube a little bit bigger. Now it's not exactly a cube. It's more of a box. But I get done and I'm thinking, this is kind of an ugly cube. So what I can do is go ahead and delete this cube. And there's two ways of doing that. You can press the delete key on your keyboard, which will instantly delete it. Or you can press X, and this will bring up a menu that asks, do you want to delete it? And you can click delete, and it'll get rid of that. So now that we've deleted this, we want to have another cube, right? We just got rid of it. So what do? Well, we can go down here, and next to our mode, we can see that we have view, select, add, and object. And you may think object is the one you want to click on, but we're going to go to add. And it'll bring up this little menu with a whole bunch of options, but right now we're only interested in mesh. So we're going to go to mesh, and we're going to pick from one of these top ones here. So these are called your primitives, and they're your basic shapes in 3D. So we want to choose our cube, right? So go ahead and click cube, and it will spawn it back in wherever your 3D cursor is, and that is this little red and white and black axis right here. So in our case, it's still in the center of the scene, so it's going to put our cube right back in the center. So if you want to get rid of these little gimbals right here, right, to move it, you can just go back to your box select and it'll get rid of it. So there's also shortcuts for each one of these. So G is the same as move, and you can move stuff around by just pressing G and dragging around. But if you want to move it locked to an axis like we were doing before, like say we want to move only on the Z or only on the X, you press G and then the corresponding axis letter. So X allows me to move it along the X. Now, if I want to do it along the Z, G, and then Z. So that's how you lock it to a particular axis if you want to move it. R is rotate, and if you just press it once, it does a free rotation. If you double tap it, it does an even more free. It has no locked axis. But if you want to move it along a particular axis. Again, it's just like when you use the move command, you press R and then say X. So this will only rotate it around the cube's X axis. So that will allow us to move the cube like this. So if we want to scale, scale is, as you might assume, S. So we have R for rotate, S for scale, G is move, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but they are all in a pretty nice location as far as hotkeys go. So you can always use these if you forget your hotkeys, but to learn G, S, and R is pretty important. So I would make sure you try to remember those best you can. So now that we've messed up our cube again, we can go and say, well, I think the rotation of this cube is fine, but maybe when we want to edit the cube itself. So we talked about the modes over here where you have texture, weight, all this stuff. So I mentioned that we're going to use object mode and edit mode the most. So if we want to edit the physical shape of the cube, what we're going to do is go into edit mode. See? And the cube itself lights up a little bit and everything's orange. And this is your selection. We saw this in the viewport that if we wanted to make a selection, it would be outlined in orange. So that was just telling me that the entire cube was selected. So you can see here that we have a few new buttons down here that we can click. These are the most important ones right now. These determine whether you're in vertex selection mode, edge selection mode, or face selection mode. So vertex selection mode gives us each of these little points. So the vertex make up the 3D object. So they're the points at which all the edges connect to, making the face of the object. So we can see that if we move around this vertex using G, so same key as to move the object in object mode, you can move this vertex around and you can see it's manipulating our 3D object here. Maybe we want to rotate that. It's not going to do a whole lot right now because vertices don't rotate so much as edges and faces do, which we'll get to in a second. But we can definitely move it and we can lock it along the axes depending on whichever direction we want to go. So you can manipulate your object like this, just moving vertices around. So if you select it and then hit G and then you like where it is, go ahead and left click and that will place it there. So now we've kind of messed up our object a little bit again, but that's okay because it's looking kind of cool. But say we want to move an entire edge. So an edge is the line here that goes between two vertices. So we can switch to edge selection by clicking edge selection down here or hitting 2 on your keyboard. If you hit 2, it puts you automatically into that selection mode. And we can see that we can select any of these edges and even move them around. So again, our basic movement applies. G allows us to move it. R now allows us to rotate it, right? Because we have a pivot point to rotate around, which is by default the median, the middle point. So that is edge selection, and that's pretty helpful. We're going to use that a lot. And then there's face selection. So if we click on face, we click on face selection mode, we can select all these faces, and the faces are the planes that are in between each vertex. So you can see if we go back to vertex mode, we have this plane right here. And if we go to face selection mode, which is hotkey 3 on the keyboard, we can select that face, and then we're also allowed to move that face. I'm going to move this one. So I'm going to move it up a little bit by locking it to the Z and rotate it just a little bit freely. So now we can see that we've made a pretty ugly object here, but maybe this is what we were going for. So we can go ahead and switch back to object mode, and now you can see that our faces, vertices, and edges all go away. We're just left with the object as it was before. So again, we can move this around and we're not going to change the actual shape of the object. We can scale it, we can rotate it, whatever you want to do, but it's not going to affect the geometry. So at this point, we've learned how to navigate the viewport, how to edit objects, how to manipulate them, how to move them around, and how to look at all the stuff in our scene, right? So we're going to go ahead and start applying these ideas to make an object, because I feel like the best way to learn Blender is to learn how to make an object, because it allows you to practice and it also forces you to learn the tools that are required to make an object. So we are going to go ahead and start making an object in the next video. So stick around for that.